Well, good evening, everyone. Those present and those who follow us online. My name is Renaud Deus, and I'm the president of the European University Institute, and it's a great pleasure, I must say, to welcome you tonight to this event where we intend to commemorate a very distinguished member of our academic community, but also, of course, but also a very dear friend for many of us. Cara Silvia, caro Sabino, cari membri della famiglia, è per noi un grandissimo piacere accogliervi qua. Come detto, è una commemorazione che si vuole anche un ricordo, direi quasi amichevole, e non solo un omaggio più accademico. Ma dobbiamo, trattandosi di un'istituzione accademica, cominciare dal lato più accademico delle cose. Those of you, and there are many in this room, who have had the privilege of knowing Antonio Cassese, know well that he was not only, as I said, a distinguished scholar, but also a man of commitment, a man for whom the study of law was not merely the study of a legal technique, but also equally importantly, an instrument of social change, because indeed he was convinced that we lived in a world that needed to be changed. We've tried to stay faithful to the spirit in which he's worked throughout his career by combining for this commemoration a series of events of different nature. We will start today by a public lecture with a keynote lecturer, Hina Jilani, who in a way is somebody who is also a symbol of commitment in addition to being a champion of human rights. So we thought it was an adequate personality to, let's say, prolong the kind of reflection initiated by Nino. But we also wanted this to be an opportunity to mobilize a number of institutions that Nino has contributed to creating during his time here at the Institute and even afterwards. Tomorrow and Saturday, the Academy of European Law, which he co-founded, will host a workshop entitled Antonio Cassese and the Nature and Limits of Legal Innovation. We also hope that this workshop will result into publication in a journal, the European Journal of International Law, of which Nino is again one of the co-founders some 30 years ago, and which is, I must say, still attached to the Institute and represented here by its editor-in-chief, Sarah Nowen. And last but not least, in a few minutes, I will give the floor to the new president of the European Society of International Law, Professor Pierre Dargent from the Université Catholique de Louvain. And I think it is, of course, appropriate to associate this very important association to this commemoration, it being, once more, one of the brainchildren of one of the many brainchildren of Antonio Cassese. This is to say that in a short time span spent here at the Institute, he has managed to left a very strong legacy, which is not only intellectual, but also institutional. You have seen that the historical archives of the Institute have, thanks to a generous donation that was made by the Cassese family, the opportunity to open a series of, and make accessible a series of materials derived from Nino's many activities. I'm pleased to say that this will be further enriched by another generous donation made by Professor Paola Gaeta and by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. So we intend to keep continuing the collection of materials, enrich the documentation that is made available to a broader public, for we're convinced that this is not only part of our mission to provide interesting materials for scholars, even scholars from new generations who can continue what has been undertaken by Nino, but also to, as I said, commemorate a very distinguished member of our community. I wouldn't want this to end this very short introduction without expressing my deep gratitude to the two co-organizers of this event, Professors Sarah Nowen and Neha Jain, without whom none of this would have been possible. And I will, of course, leave it to them to introduce our keynote lecturer in a minute. But let me now turn to Professor Pierre Dargent and give him the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président de Hoos. Dear members of the Cassese family, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me first warmly thank the Institute for having associated the European Society of International Law to this public lecture commemorating the life and the achievements of Nino Cassese on the 10th anniversary of his passing. And in particular, I would like to thank Professor Neha Jain, who is a member of the EASL board and professor at the Institute, for having suggested that the Society be associated with this event and for inviting me to say a few introductory words. I'm very sorry not to be in Florence with you today. I owe you all of you who are present in Florence an apology for not being there. And I hope there will be other opportunities to meet in person and to build more links, more close links on a personal basis between the Society and the Institute. And of course, the Society has been very grateful to the European University Institute since its inception, as the Institute is EASL's institutional host. But my task probably as EASL president is to recall, as you just mentioned, Monsieur le Président, is to recall that Professor Cassese was present at the founding meeting of the European Society of International Law. That meeting took place in late May 2001 in Florence at the Institute, and it was a gathering of about 20 well-established, well-renowned academics of international law coming from various countries: Spain, Italy, France, Switzerland, Finland, Germany, Austria, the United Kingdom, Hungary, Poland, and also Belgian academics were present. And the founding meeting was at the initiative of the editors of the European Journal of International Law, of which Nino Cassese was also a founding member and member of the editorial board. The journal had been established a short year before the Society, and the Society was also the result of the ideas of the board, the editorial board members. In particular, I think, and I'm sure I will not be contradicted on that, in particular, Joe Weiler and Bruno Sima, Bruno having served as the first president of the European Society of International Law. And the Society was established in 2001 despite the fact that there were many and sometimes very active national societies of international law in various countries in Europe, in France, in Germany, in Italy in particular. There were also, and still in existence, the national chapters of the International Law Association. Well, despite all that, there was felt that there was a need for a more European-wide network, a society that would bring together all the people that in government, in international organizations, in the academic world, and in practice were practicing, teaching international law in Europe. And the idea was not to replace, not to federate the various national societies, but really to establish a new network that would complement national societies of international law in the various countries that had already national societies. But let us not forget that many countries in Europe at the time had no national society of international law whatsoever. And the European Society was also there to help and serve those scholars, those colleagues in those countries to be able to connect with each other and establish a European-wide network. And of course, beyond Europe, because the society has a membership that goes today much beyond Europe. It is the largest society of international law currently in Europe with about 1,400 members. And it is a very grateful thing. And we are very grateful to the Institute for having helped and hosted the society from its inception. And I was not present in Florence for the founding meeting, but maybe Nino Cassese, I don't know, we have no archives, but maybe he would have liked the European Society of International Law to be called the European Society for International Law, because that maybe would have reflected more precisely his idea that indeed law was made for social change also. I'm not going to bother you with EASL's numerous activities and conferences over the past years. And I would simply like to end my speech with a personal recollection of Nino Cassese. We did not know each other very well. I think we met in 2001 in the Great Hall of Justice at the International Court of Justice when I was arguing a case for the DRC, the arrest warrant case. I'm not sure that Nino Cassese really liked the argument I presented to the court, but nevertheless, we met then. And then we met about 10 years later, again in The Hague. He was the president of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. And in the meantime, I had left the university and I was working as first secretary of the International Court of Justice. And it must have been in the spring, I think, of 2010. And we had lunch together. We had a lunch together in the Restaurant des Juges, in the new wing of the Peace Palace. And this lunch was extremely enjoyable. It was as if we had knew each other for years. He was immediately friendly and engaging, immediately interested in what I was doing, in the pending cases, etc. And suddenly, in the middle of our conversation, in the middle of our lunch, after discussing the political intricacies of electing judges through the United Nations, he stopped me and he asked, Pierre, on the bench of your court, well, this court, as I recall, this is the International Court of Justice. And he said, Pierre, on the bench of your court, do you have at least a third of good judges? Because if you have 5 good, 5 serious, dedicated judges out of 15, then you are in safe hands. That is fine. You only need a third of them. If you have less than 5 good judges out of 15, if you have less than a third, then you are in trouble. But do you have at least a third of your judges that are good, reliable judges? I've always remembered that remark, out of the blue, very blunt, very sincere, a remark coming from a man with vast experience in human institutions. It was a remark that may have sounded cynical or pessimistic, but it was exactly the opposite. It was the remark of a man of experience who knew the failings of human beings and of their institutions. And Nino's remark was a perfect combination of his realism and at the same time of his optimism. The best designed institutions are only worth what decent people make of them. And the good news, and this is the optimistic part in his message, the good news is that as long as you have 5 judges out of 15, you are safe, you can go forward, you are in decent hand, and you can turn that institution into a strong, worthwhile institution. I'll leave you here, and I would let you guess what my answer to his enduring question was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Darjon. Thank you, Pierre. It's too bad we don't have you here for the aperitivo. We could have teased the answer out of you, but we'll have to guess, unfortunately, next time when we have you here. But thank you for that wonderful anecdote, which in some ways is emblematic of Professor Antonio Cassese, one of those rare individuals who managed to effortlessly combine the seemingly impossible demands of a life lived as a true Florentine, with deep personal and professional roots in the city, a cosmopolitan European who exercised a profound influence on European international legal thought and institutions, and also a global citizen who tirelessly examined and emphasized international law's human dimension, both in his own pioneering scholarship and professional commitments, but also through his many colleagues and students, some of whom are here with us today. And so it's only fitting that we honor Professor Cassese's legacy with a keynote speaker who embodies the relentless courage as well as the profound wisdom that characterized his own life and work, and who's also connected to one of the most challenging roles he undertook in his lifetime, which is the helmsmanship of the International Commission of Inquiry on Darfur. I'm delighted to welcome amongst our midst Ms. Hina Jilani, human rights lawyer and pro-democracy campaigner extraordinaire, who has dedicated her life and her career to giving a voice to the voiceless, in particular minorities, women, and political prisoners. Like Professor Cassese, Ms. Jilani too gives a lie to the adage that a prophet has no honor in her own home. A lawyer practicing in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, Ms. Jilani established Pakistan's first all-women's law firm in the 1980s, and was one of the founders of Pakistan's National Human Rights Commission. The cases litigated through these efforts have resulted in landmark judgments on women's and human rights, and they continue to influence the Pakistani and the broader South Asian legal landscape. But one of the proudest moments of her career came a few years later, when she was appointed the first special representative of the UN Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders, a role in which she served with distinction for 8 years. It was also during this period that she served on the Darfur Commission with Professor Cassese. She has since continued a tireless crusade for human rights through her leadership in various national and international bodies, including as a member of the UN fact-finding mission on Gaza, and most recently, through her appointment to the International Commission of Inquiry into systematic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States following the killing of George Floyd. I remember listening to Ms. Jilani in London some years back when she quoted Desmond Tutu's statement that we are all prisoners of hope. And if that is true, that is one prison she doesn't want to leave. Thank you, Ms. Jilani, for continuing to hold on to that hope for a truer, fairer, and more just world. And through your example, also helping us to do the same when our courage might be failing us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Hina Jilani, and please enjoy this lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Jain. It's really good to see you in person, finally. President of the EUI, Mr. Dihus, Professor Darjon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this event to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the passing of Antonio Cassese. And I would like to thank the European University Institute and the European Society of International Law for giving me this opportunity to recall the memories I have of Professor Cassese, or Nino as his friends called him. I had not known Professor Cassese personally before I had the privilege to work with him on the International Commission of Inquiry on violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Darfur. But of course, I was very well aware of his reputation as a distinguished scholar and of his work on the Yugoslav tribunal as the president of that tribunal. So I was really looking forward to hearing more about what the man is like. Because at that time, if you remember, the whole question of the situation in Darfur had become very politicized, especially with regard to this whole question of whether the situation there merited to be qualified as genocide. So I was a little apprehensive about this mission when I got the message that Louise Arbour wanted to speak to me urgently, and I was on a mission at that time in my capacity as the special representative of the Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders. So when I spoke to Louise Arbour, and she told me that they would like me to be a part of this commission of inquiry, I did instinctively feel a little bit of apprehension that we may not be used politically in this situation, which in my opinion at that time and in my estimate of the situation had become very politicized. And I heard Louise Arbour laugh at my fear that there would be some kind of political manipulation. And she said, you know, we are making Antonio Cassese the chair of this commission of inquiry. And I mean, she had then given me at least a 5-minute lecture on not just his scholarly competence, but also the integrity of the man. And she said, in his presence, I don't think anybody can even dare to try and influence this commission one way or the other. So that was my first introduction to the man, and not just the scholar, before we even started to work together. And you know what? I'm happy to say that everything that Louise had said and others who I then consulted, like Andrew Clapham and Mona Rishmawi, again, people who I trust and whose judgment I trust. And I must say that, you know, everything they had said about his integrity, his competence, and more was demonstrated in his leadership of that mission. You know, during the course of the inquiry, we found in Darfur, we found sufficient and credible material to conclude that government forces and militias had conducted indiscriminate attacks, including killing of civilians, torture, and forced disappearances, destruction of villages, rape and other forms of sexual violence, pillaging, and forced displacement throughout the Darfur region. In their discussions with the Commission, however, the government of Sudan officials always came back to us and stated that any attacks carried out by government armed forces in Darfur were of counter-insurgency purposes and were conducted on the basis of military imperatives. Now, in such a situation, we needed the best expertise on international law that we could get to define the parameters of what military necessity was in that situation that we were observing in Darfur, in order to make it clear that the government's claims were false, both in fact as well as law. Now, you know, the way that Antonio Cassese would confront the government, both in law and on law and on facts, was something worth watching. And I think Mona will remember those exchanges between government officials and Antonio Cassese. And in the end, you know, every time the government tried to defend their action, there would be visible signs of embarrassment on their faces, because they knew that they were not dealing with a novice. They were dealing with somebody who knew exactly what the law was, but also knew what the human dimensions of the situation that he was applying that law to were. So I think in that sense, this was something that was extremely impressive for me. Even at that time, I myself was also not a novice on the situations of conflict that I had been seeing firsthand, obviously in my own region, but also as a part of the UN. But you know, I must say, the Darfur mission was so much of a learning experience for me as a lawyer, as a human rights defender, as a person who believed in the rule of law and democracy. And I really learned a lot from Antonio Cassese. Antonio Cassese, although he understood the human dimensions of the situations that he was looking at, and I'm sure that his own experiences of dealing with situations of conflict, you know, in Lebanon and on the Yugoslavian tribunal and other situations that he was looking at. He was a scholar, he was no activist, let me tell you this much. So the impression he made on me as an activist was profound, because I realized how important it is for activists to do their activism in a more informed manner. And how important it is for us then to understand the value of not neutrality, we are never neutral, but the value of fairness, of good judgment, of observing things in a non-partisan way and not being influenced by extraneous circumstances in our analysis of the situation that we are seeing. And you know, we had to answer very difficult questions there, and we did have a very important task to do. For instance, this whole determination of genocide, whether genocide had occurred, and looking at the situation in Darfur, can we qualify the situation as a genocide? You cannot imagine, and Mona, I'm sure, is listening, and others who remember that time in 2004 when this mission was ongoing and were involved in different capacities, will remember there was so much pressure for this commission to hold that genocide had occurred in Darfur. And I tell you, despite the pressure, I'm sure none of us took the pressure. I myself am quite confident that pressure doesn't work on me. But Antonio Cassese was heading the commission, and he was getting messages all the time, in many ways encouraging him to qualify the situation as a genocide. He resisted that. Why? Because this man knew the law. He knew the law. He had the capacity to observe keenly very minute issues with regard to that situation, and then to apply the law in an honest manner with the kind of competence he had in international law. And he found that the situation did not amount to genocide. But this did not end there. He went on to insist that we make sure, and we all agreed with him, that we did some service to international criminal law by saying that genocide is a crime, but so are all the others. And what we had found in the course of our investigation that indiscriminate killings, torture, and forced disappearances that had occurred were serious human rights violations and international crimes, and merited as much condemnation as anything to do with genocide. And so I would really recommend to everyone who's interested in the application of international law to read this document, the report of the International Commission of Inquiry, and particularly the sections on the analysis of the law on genocide and whether the situation in Darfur qualified to be called a genocide. I really recommend people to learn, to see that even today, it is a brilliant piece of scholarly interpretation of that particular law and of related international law to it. I'm also going to remind you that another difficult question was the recommendation to the Security Council that the Commission put out was that the situation in Darfur be referred to the ICC. And I can tell you, we did make that recommendation, and we were all unanimous in making that recommendation. But I can tell you that we did this not lightly. There were so many discussions, and discussions that were not only led by Antonio Cassese, but informed the whole commission on why we have to take this, this possibility that the law gives to us in this particular situation. And then there was this other thing I think I need to mention. The wisdom of Antonio Cassese, his belief in due process and fairness was really at the bottom of our decision not to reveal the names of those that we actually did find were the perpetrators. But he advised that, in all fairness, we are not doing a criminal investigation in that sense, and we don't have proof of that standard. And he wrote a whole section also on the standard of proof. That's why I'm recommending to people, and especially law students, to read this report. It is really, really a piece of great wisdom and scholarly writing on international law. Now, what I'm going to say today is really based on the situations that we have seen emerging throughout the world. In my own experience, for instance, what I saw in Darfur, what I see today in Sudan, and how I really look at the efficacy of the current responses to the situations of conflict today. Darfur was as profoundly affected by conflict in 2004. It is still, you see, there is not only now conflict in Darfur, but because of the kind of continued long-term conflict, this situation of crisis has spread to the whole of the country. And we see where Sudan is today. Look at the situation of Afghanistan. And I'm mentioning some situations to you only. I'm only asking you to keep these in mind when I make my presentation, because what I say may seem to be in the abstract, but if you keep the situations in mind, and you will see how much these are a common trend that we see in many parts of the world. So ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying that even though contemporary threats to security extend far beyond wars between states, we can very confidently say that peace can no longer be equated with the absence of war. The peace we should strive for must be based on the cooperation between groups or nations and the elimination of the root causes of conflicts. This approach is embodied in the now well-established mechanisms of peace building, which aim to prevent the resumption of hostilities by defining and supporting structures to strengthen peace. These days, many communities are besieged by violence in the name of religion, ethnicity, and rejection of diverse identities. Communal tensions bred by intolerance, hatred, and extremism destroy the values of humanity and can lead to massive and systemic human rights violations, such as those resulting from apartheid, colonialism, or foreign domination and occupation. People's inability to recognize the merits of diversity has not only produced oppressive societies and divided nations, but has also diminished the possibilities of finding a common interest in promoting peace to achieve the welfare of all. Internal armed conflicts, terrorist campaigns, insurgencies, food crises, and long-term political economic instability have placed the human security of vast populations in peril. Large-scale movements of people fleeing for their lives or escaping various forms of persecution is a continuing crisis that has a direct link to social and political repression. The cumulative impact of these conditions is affecting global peace. The consequences of long-drawn conflicts are encompassing a wider sphere of political and economic interests, making it more challenging than in the past to find acceptable solutions. And we are confronted with more and more impediments to peace than we are bestowed with any kinds of tools to move towards a more peaceful world today. The persistence of internal strife in many parts of the world is no longer only a matter of internal national concern. This is why a new paradigm has developed at the international level, according to which serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law occurring in a country may be characterized as threats to international peace and security. This paradigm has materialized in the rise of international criminal justice. The establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was a recognition of the fact that serious human rights violations and international humanitarian law violations constitute threats to international peace and security. The provision for referring the situation to the ICC when the Security Council considers that this situation constitutes a threat to international peace and security strengthens the legitimacy of international action to deter conduct that has resulted in serious violations of international law. Unfortunately, we are experiencing a decline in the quality of world leadership. This lack of political vision is likely to lower capacities of states to address the causes of conflicts. This collective failure to restore hope for peace and people's security has given more critical dimensions to the present crises we observe. Indeed, responses to conflict and crisis, where political or economic, instead of restoring security, have themselves become part of the problem. This is apparent from the solutions that prevail in this is apparent from situations that prevail in several parts of the world. In Asia and Africa, for instance, because I know more about these two continents, several countries have emerged or are in the process of transitioning from authoritarian rule, armed conflicts, or struggles for the right to self-determination. Many countries in both continents have adopted national constitutions with strong guarantees for the protection of human rights. With a few exceptions, most of these countries in the regions have enjoyed periods of political stability during which credible elections were held. Despite these significant advancements, political and economic conditions in many of these countries remain volatile. Some of these countries show visible signs of reversal of these initial advancements and are trapped in a perpetual state of transition. This is largely due to inadequate attention given to the establishment or the restoration of the rule of law, and to inculcating a culture of respect for human rights in state institutions as well as in governance practices. In many countries, stability rather than development has become an imperative to be achieved through the use of state force to repress popular movements and protests against economic and social disempowerment. This mode of governance has resulted in narrowing the space for dialogue and increased public resentment against authorities. Flaws in the agenda of economic development pursued by many states are amply reflected in the growing poverty and social exclusion of a large sector of their populations. Serious violations of economic, social, and cultural rights have become engraved in actions of the state. In my region, we have observed that multinational corporations and other non-state agents have acquired an enormous degree of control over the life and liberties of the people. There are several examples when coercive power of the state has been used against communities and human rights defenders, at times at the behest of powerful economic interests and sometimes also as a measure to appease extremist ideologies. Leaders of indigenous and other minority communities, leaders of movements of the poor, environmental and anti-globalization activists, trade union leaders, women human rights defenders, migrants and refugees are increasingly being targeted. These trends could lead to a further increase in violations and a future crisis of human rights in that region. It is therefore imperative to find approaches to economic development that secure people's social and cultural progress through means that do not create a conflict of interest between communities and become the basis of further tension or civil strife. And I don't mean that can be only a conflict of interest between communities. There can be a conflict of interest between the people and the interests of the state. There are certain states that have shown a tendency to take on an identity of its own to the exclusion of their people and have structured and constructed their security impediments in a manner in which much of what they do in response to those security impediments that they construct without consulting the people is in fact contradictory to the interest of the people, but only goes to strengthen state control. Political conditions and practices of governance adopted by states primarily determine the degree of risk and insecurity to which people in general and some communities in particular become exposed. An appreciable weakening of the rule of law has been observed in different countries where insufficient, not genuinely representative democracies prevail with little or no space for citizen participation and without accountability or transparency. Severe restrictions on the freedom of information, expression, and assembly imposed particularly in the name of religious ideology or the security or integrity of the state in many countries have limited the access to information or sites of violations, thereby frustrating attempts to monitor situations and to report violations. National security laws have been imposed in the severest forms in many countries of the world. In some countries, such laws are a permanent part of the domestic legal framework. This has effectively weakened fundamental rights and has diminished the efficiency for their enforcement mechanisms. In areas where armed conflict or political tensions are current, emergency or special laws are imposed to suspend fundamental freedoms and to restrict access to civilian courts. The introduction of rules of exceptions, for example, through special legislation for security in general or against terrorism in particular, has affected the ability of national judicial systems to protect people from arbitrary actions. The social climate created in the name of countering terrorism has led to instability without ensuring security. Some governments have used the current climate to abuse the enhanced powers they gained in the campaign against terrorism to target political opposition, movements for self-determinations, and those defending human rights. A perception that security imperatives justify departures from established human rights standards has been deliberately nourished to condone these deviations. This has encouraged xenophobia, intolerance, and hatred in many societies. When societies fail to challenge the misconceived idea of the trade-off between security and human rights, most often they get neither. And minorities and other vulnerable groups typically pay the greater price. Such assaults on the rule of law and human rights are likely to become more and more entrenched if the current trends are not reversed. Other significant sources of conflict or tension are the politics of identity. Greater difficulties in the management of pluralism and diversity, increasing poverty, and diminishing role of the state in providing social security. The situation of women in many countries of the world is of particular concern. Their rights are violated in the name of religion and culture, and they become particularly vulnerable to prejudice, to exclusion, and to public repudiation, not only by state forces, but by social actors as well. Ladies and gentlemen, human rights and humanitarian law were not drafted with peace and political stability in mind. Rather, the basic purpose of this legal system is to provide states with a framework that allows them to respond effectively to even the most serious of crises. Therefore, human rights are not and can never be a luxury to be cast aside at times of difficulty. International law is the foundation that will help states respond effectively to whatever difficulties arise, including civil strife, armed insurgency, and terrorism. Preservation of peace and security is a core objective in the Charter of the United Nations. The implementation and respect of fundamental human rights is another, as initially reflected in the Charter and then laid down more precisely in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. History has eloquently illustrated how closely linked these two objectives are. Human rights violations are almost always the underlying cause or the consequence of deterioration in peace and security. Bringing an end to armed conflict and restoring peace and security typically require progress in addressing ongoing human rights violations and ending impunity for past violations. It is, however, far less challenging to identify human rights concerns and to set an agenda for change than it is to bring about conditions, political, economic, and social, that would allow the realization of rights. Repeated and prolonged periods of political crises and economic instability in many parts of the world have restrained progress towards a stable environment in which respect for human rights finds the best guarantees. While states have progressively enhanced their power of control, the role of the state in protection has diminished. These trends continue to impede prospects for democracy respect for human rights and the rule of law, and the potential for development. An intelligent and creative choice of national and international mechanisms is now vital, not only to strengthen democracy and the rule of law, but also to effectively counter trends that pose a threat to these prospects, such as extremism and intolerance. Informed electoral processes that ensure genuinely representative democracies with ample space for citizen participation and credible accountability systems need to be promoted. Effective judicial systems must be supported by complete judicial independence if people are to draw real benefit from protections that are normally available under a constitutional framework. Initiatives for legal empowerment of the poor to relieve social exclusion and discrimination, exploitation of labor, eviction from land and displacement, and for conferring the right to control over natural resources would contribute towards bringing peace to communities. Such a move forward requires a creative relationship between states and the civil society so that the people's dignity and security is placed at the center of any approach towards governance. A significant development in recent times is the growing strength and capacity of civil societies in many parts of the world. Civil society actors have played a significant role in inducing recognition by the state of the concepts of participatory democracy, transparency, and accountability. At the same time, human rights defenders and other civil society actors have taken important initiatives for transformation of societies that still carry biases, which drive social behavior towards discrimination, hatred, and violence. Finally, I would stress that multilateralism, international cooperation, and a sense of collective responsibility to end violence remain critical elements in removing the foremost threats to peace and security. Ladies and gentlemen, I see, and I'm sure that you agree with me, that there are many challenges that are already testing the resolve of the international community to promote accommodation and tolerance in order to prevent the erosion of peace and harmony. I fervently hope that such a resolve at the international level leads the world out of the crises we confront today, and that people learn the value of coexistence and shared progress. This may be a wish that may not be achieved in the short term, but I'm sure that the combined efforts of those who are committed to peace, security, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law will bear results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jilani, and also making come alive the experience of Darfur, which is, of course, part of how one writes the long history of international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict and how it's evolved, but also then taking us beyond that into thinking about the future of the international law of conflict and humanitarian law and how it might need to evolve. We have about 10 minutes, perhaps. Ms. Jilani has very kindly offered to also answer any questions that anybody might have. We have about roughly 10 minutes for that. And in the times in which we find ourselves with this hybrid mode and COVID, if you do have any questions, please sort of wave wildly at me and I will try and pay attention. And then if you could please come up to that podium so that online, whoever's joining us online can also hear you. So I'm quite short, as you might have noticed. So please do wave wildly, and I will be paying attention. Or if there are hands up online, Jasmine as well. Megan.
Third time lucky. Many thanks, Ms. Jilani, for the wonderful address, which really did evoke very vividly the task that was before you and Professor Cassese in Darfur. I wondered if you could speak to what seems to have struck me and others who've read about Professor Cassese's work in terms of his enthusiasm for factual investigation. In so many aspects of his work, people have noted that he really had this incredible, relentless forensic curiosity. And I wondered if you had any comments on that element of his commitment to the Darfur project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. And I should have mentioned it before, it was in my mind, but I just missed doing that. You know, we used to go during our inquiry in Darfur, we used to go to investigate sites. And, you know, I used to observe Antonio Cassese, how he would be looking in, you know, every aspect of what we were looking at, keenly observing, perhaps. And then, you know, he would have a very thoughtful expression on his face. He was probably looking at the situation, the facts, the evidence that witnesses were giving us, all the testimonies. And then he would go home. And at night, he would produce something based on these facts. And his analysis, not just of the fact, but then the application of the law to show what it meant in terms of the behavior that he observed or concluded from the testimonies that he was getting, or the inspection of a particular site that he had looked at. And then produce reams of paper the next morning for the rest of the commission to study and see what he had concluded from our evaluation of what we saw at a particular site. Sometimes Mona, of course, had a very difficult task because we had limited, space to write the report. And it must have been extremely difficult for her to see how she could edit these profound passages that he was writing in terms of the forensic analysis of places that he visited and the sites that we visited and the testimony of oral testimony that we got. So yes, it was one of those things that was very impressive about him. And I remember one instance where just by chance, we came upon a building where one of the human rights people who was with us pointed out to us and said, you know, that particular building, that is really a secret detention center. So you should have seen this spring in his footsteps. And, you know, he went around that building, observed every corner of it and said, yes, it's likely that this is so. All the windows are closed. It's a warm morning, afternoon. And I don't think people would close their windows in this locality at that particular time of the day. There is something suspicious about this building. So, you know, this was just an example of how people like him observe the signs so well to see whether there is a possibility that this might be a situation which they would like to observe. So the next meeting we had was with the officials. So he raised this point with them. And he asked them whether they would allow him to go and look at that building. First, of course, they were very polite and they said, no, there's nothing of that sort. And then they became really aggressive, trying to prevent us from going to that building to see where it was, what it was. I mean, we went no further than that on this issue. But I can tell you that what you just said in your question about his keen observation is very true. And that's one instant I remember of this, but there were many during the few days that we were there in Darfur, and not in just one particular place. We were all over in that region. And in every place that he went to, I wasn't with him in certain sections during certain periods of our inquiry, but other people from the group were there. And I remember that many of us shared this and sometimes had a laugh about how insistent he is at times on not just hearing testimonies, but on actually going to visit sites and making up our mind on about the situation from what we gather from these sites.
Thank you, Megan, for breaking the ice. And by the way, Megan is a key intellectual part of the workshop that will take place over the next 2 days. She's really the intellectual driver behind that entire project. A follow-up question on your comment, reams of paper, Mrs. Jilani. In the European Journal of International Law, a few years ago, we had a symposium titled International Commissions of Inquiry, What Difference Do They Make? And it was empirical research into the difference that commissions of inquiry make. And what was interesting to see is that they usually can achieve one thing and also their exact opposite. So it's very difficult to predict, but they can lead to more accountability, but they can also be a fig leaf for actual accountability because we've had a commission of inquiry. So it's difficult to predict as a result because they're always, both results are possible. But the one thing was clear, what always comes out of a commission of inquiry is a next commission of inquiry. There's always a follow-up commission because one thing that's always necessary is more investigations. And I think Darfur is a good example of that. We've seen several commissions of inquiry in Darfur. I think yours has been one of the most authoritative one. We've seen Sudanese commissions of inquiry in Darfur. The African Union has done its own. How do you, in your work, feel, or how do you judge when a commission of inquiry is actually, you think, a valuable contribution? And when do you feel yourself, oh, there we go again, more reams of paper, but perhaps what we actually need is something else?
It's a good question. I think a much effort now has been put into making sure that we have a result-oriented commissions of inquiries who say something that has some value in determining the status in that particular situation of governments, of non-state actors, of the civilians involved. But at the same time, I think there's a simple answer to this. It requires integrity. It requires competence. And it requires, more than anything, the ability to say everything. I think a commission of inquiry where you hold back anything, not just to avoid somebody being held accountable, but just to be less controversial. If there is a confidence in your observation, your analysis, and your conclusion, I think we need to say it. And I have seen less impressive reports of such inquiries when they have failed to say and have kept back anything which they should have said in the inquiry. And these inquiries, I feel, have much less value and much less benefit to the populations whose security was being sought as a part of this inquiry.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jilani, for also answering these questions. I think Pierre Dargent said Antonio Cassese was both curious as well as candid. You've indulged our curiosity and you've been remarkably candid with your answers. So thank you very much for that. And now it's time for us to move to the concluding part of today's program, because Professor Cassese was, of course, not just ours at the EUI, at the European University Institute, but he was also of the University of Florence. He was not only of the European Journal of International Law, but also of the Journal of International Criminal Justice. And so we're delighted to share Professor Cassese with you, and with the concluding remarks by Professor Michaela Frulli, who worked very closely with Professor Cassese, and who's now a professor of public international law at the University of Florence, and Professor Salvatore Zappalà, who's the professor of international law at the University of Catania School of Law, and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Criminal Justice. Thank you for allowing us to share Professor Cassese with you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody, ladies and gentlemen, Silvia, Teresa, Francesco, Sabino. It's a great honor to be here. And first of all, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the European University Institute for organizing this public ceremony, which brings us all together to honor the memory of Antonio Cassese, and for inviting me to give a brief tribute to Nino, as we all called him. And you will forgive my great emotion, but it's due to the presence of so many friends here. And I know that many are connected online with whom we shared a lot along the years, and including many endeavors under Nino's guidance. What I would like to share with you tonight is a brief memory of the person, Antonio Cassese, and I think it matches a lot of what have been said already by others. Because I think if I were to account for even a small part of his professional achievements, it would take many hours just to make the list. There will be many other occasions to discuss in depth Antonio Cassese's contribution to the many fields in which he was active. And again, thank you to Sarah Nouwen and Nia Jane, and also to Professor Donaldson for organizing the workshop in the next few days, in which his contribution to international law will be assessed. For our part at the University of Florence, where Antonio Cassese was indeed professor from 1975 to 2008, of course, with all the interruptions for the Institute and for all, of course, his other responsibilities, we organized an annual event dedicated to his memory, the Antonio Cassese Lecture, and actually the 10th edition will take place tomorrow. But let me come to my personal remembrance of Antonio Cassese, a short portrait of a great man. And I will start with a few words on Nino's personality that I believe was closely entwined with his way of being a scholar and a lawyer. Antonio Cassese was, as you know, everybody said already tonight, a person full of energy, interests, ideas, curious about everything new, and not only in the law. He was very curious about art and literature and all the forms of culture. He demanded a lot from himself and from others, but at the same time, he was extremely generous in making himself available to anyone needing his help. And those who had the privilege to have him as a mentor know very well that you could always count on his guidance, on his advice. He was a tireless worker. Again, this has come up already tonight, very determined, always looking to see how he could best contribute to the various projects on which he was working. He was also a man, as I said before, of great culture and fine irony. I think we all remember his jokes, with a keen eye on the world, very sensitive to the daily tragedies of human life, animated, as he used to say, by a Gramscian-inspired optimism of the will, to which he resorted to reflect the dramatic reality of the human condition and to relentlessly look for every possible way to improve it. In fact, I believe that his vocation, I would say his calling, his beruf in the Weberian sense, the demon who held the very fiber of his life was the unquenched desire to make the world a better place for every human being. And to that end, to do his part to humanize the law. And definitely, I think he heeded the command of his demon. And I think it was precisely this vocation that led him to turn his attention to international law. In fact, the field of law where power relations are laid bare and where the role of violence is predominant, and also Ms. Jilani was clearly telling us today. Very early on, he directed his activity as a scholar to study the topics in which abuses of sovereignty most seriously affect individuals: armed conflicts, gross human rights violations, mass atrocities. And as a jurist, he always kept asking himself, to what extent can legal rules introduce a minimum of humanity into the unleashing of violence? And in fact, in doing this, he never engaged in a formalistic exercise, giving an uncritical account of the rules regulating international relations, but he aimed at unveiling the rationale behind the rules, and at the same time at ameliorating the law itself in the interest of humanity. And those, again, who had the privilege, the fortune to know him, I think can confirm that this conviction guided him in all his activities. Truthfully, it was enough even to hear him speak for a few minutes to draw profound inspiration from his words. And this vocation, I think, besides leading him to study the impact of the law on human beings, led him to adopt and to transmit to younger generations of scholars a methodology based on what he called critical positivism. Because although accepting the basic axioms of positivism, he was also conscious of its limitations, and he was always worried, especially about two limitations: the fact that a purely positivist approach could intrinsically hinder the progressive development of the law, and also the fact that such an approach could lead jurists to justify the actions of an authoritarian regime. And for these reasons, he always considered very important to accompany the study of the law with the study of history, of political science, of sociology, and other social sciences that could provide a complete picture of the dynamics of the international community and help to improve the rules and ultimately to promote the protection of individuals. And still, I think his calling that led him to become a real champion of the struggle to humanize the law at various levels. In fact, as you all know, we have been talking about this already today. He did not limit himself to excel in scientific research, in academic life, but he has taken on public offices and responsibilities at the highest international level, thus seeking to make not only a theoretical contribution, but also a practical one, a concrete contribution to the drafting and application of new rules, and to foster accountability of both states and individuals for the most serious violations of international law. And I want to add also that in carrying out these activities, he has never taken a purely idealistic stance. He was very realistic, as it was said already before. He always gave a realistic account of the ambiguities characterizing the attitude of states. And despite moments of great pessimism, he always believed that the law could play a very important role in securing a remedy for victims and preventing future violation of human rights. And also Ms. Jilani was telling us a few moments ago. From my point of view, the most important legacy that he left us is precisely this: that of conceiving of the law as an instrument at the service of society, at the service of the weakest, of the most vulnerable subjects, and therefore as a tool for reducing injustice and inequality. And he also left us as an example his commitment, his determination to pursue these objectives without sparing any energy. He certainly perceived this task as a moral duty. However, he was convinced that being a scholar and a practitioner at the highest possible level was not enough. He also pointed to the moral pressure exerted by public opinion and non-governmental organizations as a path that could increasingly become important to make the rights written on paper effective. So he was a strong supporter of civil society organizations. He never spared his efforts in this direction. And also, he became an unfaltering communicator because he thought that it was very important to inform the public opinion at large about the serious violations of international law and about the remedies to be loudly demanded. That's why he engaged in reaching a wider audience through some unforgettable books and also essays, and through many articles written for the press, for the international and the Italian press. To be honest, I think that if he were with us today, he would be very active on social media, and probably he would have his own podcast by now. By and large, And I'm concluding, the man and the judge, the scholar and the communicator have taken turns in a lifetime spent understanding humanity and trying to help it out of its darkest evil. And I think it is precisely because of these characteristics, which I have very poorly summarized, that I believe his contribution has made a difference in all the areas in which he worked and in all the roles that he played. And for the same reasons, I think today his writings are not outdated. If you read them, it seems like they were written, a few days ago, if not always for the specific content, of course, surely for the breadth of analysis and for the wise vision that's still stemming from his reflections. And at least this makes us feel his absence a little less. But I think, it's now time to pass the word to my dear friend, Salvatore Zappalà, but allow me to conclude with just one quote that Nino himself chose to conclude one of his last books, The Five Masters of International Law. It is a quote taken from a letter of Joffe to Trotsky, and I quote, "Human life is only of value to us so long as and insofar as it serves that infinity which mankind represents to our mind." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And how am I going to do this? I don't know. Actually, it's certainly not one of my skills, that of presenting concluding remarks, and certainly not before such an audience. I will say a few words, and then I hope somebody else will really conclude and draw the conclusions of this meeting. It's very hard to. I mean, in here I saw Luigi Condorelli coming in, and I thought he is the well-known man of conclusions, of great conclusions. In all our conferences, we say that. It's a true blessing for me, and thank you very much to the Institute, to the organizers, and to those who have conceived this event, because it's a pleasure to be with family and friends. Family of Nino and friends of Nino. It's a pleasure to see you. It's a pleasure to be among you. And it's, in a way, I am really glad. I don't have much to say, because all the testimonies you've been hearing, and actually all the testimonies we've been hearing in the past 10 years, on several occasions where Nino's passing was commemorated, the picture that comes out is pretty much the same. There is no Rashomon effect. We don't have the 7 samurais telling different stories. And this means something very important, that Nino was a true person. He was the way he was, and we all were able to see those sides, that curiosity which many people referred to, and that Pierre d'Argent experienced, that questioning over lunch, which was one of his skills. Come, we go for lunch and let's discuss this, but he would not let you escape the answer. There was no alternative. That passion for building, Nino was a man for the future. He was never really being content with what he had done. He would always look forward and realize the next project and think about the next project. Actually, there is not much to say by a man that was described by the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, in 2011, upon his passing, as a giant of international law, as somebody who was referred to as the architect of international criminal justice. And actually, he really wanted to be the architect of international criminal justice. I think this idea of the archives is very good, and the more people will look into the archives, the more they will find. Nino was here, of course, at the Institute between 87 and 93, I think. But he was back at the Institute also at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies between 2003 and 2006. Nino really believed in the ICC and wanted, although he had not been elected as a judge at the court, he really wanted to do his best to try to make this institution work. I don't know, I mean, I don't know how he will assess where the ICC is now and how he will assess the problems the ICC had. But certainly he wanted to give a contribution to that institution, which he felt he had given a contribution to establish by doing concrete things. And there were two areas in which he felt it was absolutely necessary for him to work. One of them was to try to improve the ratio Pierre Dargent was referring earlier. If you have 5 judges over 15, it's good. And he thought that the good way to do that was to establish a sort of training program for international criminal judges or for judges who had to work in international criminal law. And he managed to convince both the European Commission and Yves Meny to establish that program here at the Institute. And with that program, there was an attempt with this European training in higher international criminal sciences, the ethics project, which was only a name, but in reality, his idea was to convene the judges around the table, as normally it is done at the European University Institute, and engage them in discussions, engage them in papers, perhaps written by PhD students working at the Institute on topical issues, and trying through that to educate them in a way. He was not too modest about that. He explicitly said on some occasions, and maybe this backfired on that project. Bureaucracy in a way, and I refer to the bureaucracy of the ICC, killed a bit that idea. We had our first training course here in Florence, then we traveled to Peru, to Senegal, to China, to Latvia. But it was clear that the court did not really like the idea of coming to Florence or coming to other places in the world and being educated in international criminal law, because probably they thought they knew better. They didn't want a link with an institution such as the European Union because they feared they would be perceived as too European. Well, the court has been perceived like that the same, so without the educational part. So, I mean, there was this attempt, but the idea was we have the institutions, we have the field, but we still have to learn. And Nino was applying this concept that we still have to learn to himself. He would always be keen on learning. He would be thirsty for knowledge about pretty much everything he would that would meet his interest. And criminal law was the same. His approach to criminal law was, I'm going to go and study all the classics in criminal law. I'll cut it short because I know I am the obstacle between the reception, between you and the reception. But at the other limb of this intellectual idea of creating an international criminal justice that would work was the more theoretical work, if you want. And he thought that there was room and need for an academic publication. This is why he created the Journal of International Criminal Justice, of which I am the editor-in-chief now, the pro tempore editor-in-chief, but we kept emphasizing funded by Nino Cassese because actually that was his creature, his children. And I saw Jackie Gordon earlier on in the public. She was with us in the very early days, and she would remember the way in which the very I think I said this already in the past, but the very artisanal way in which this was handcrafted. It was a sort of bottega fiorentina. I am clearly now repeating a sentence which I have already used, so I will stop there with the analogy, but that was the idea. And the idea was to work on the two levels, revisit the classics, obtain papers, engage and cross-cutting papers by great scholars, already well-established and well-known in the area of criminal law or criminal procedure or international humanitarian law, human rights law, but above all, engage with young scholars. Nino really had this love for the ideas, and very often the ideas come from the raw material which young scholars are made of. And he would engage with them. I've never really seen him giving back a paper saying just, this is not a good idea. go back and redo it entirely. He would always provide comments. He would always provide support. He would always, if of course he would see that there was something in what any of us, I would say, but any paper that he would read for the journal from scholars or students that he would not know. He would just read the paper and say, there is a wonderful idea here. The paper is very bad. It's not written in English, but there is an idea. So Salvatore, here is the paper, go work and try to flesh it out and send it back with comments to the author. But very often he would give me back his typescript with all his notes. And there were many. But in a way, this was the approach he wanted to take to international criminal justice, international criminal law. Not just writing about it, not just having been the president of the ICTY, not just experiencing it in his own activities, but also try to make it work, to try to make the world a better place. I think Michaela said it right. I think Judge Yusuf, the former president of ICJ, had said it in analogous terms, which I had quoted, but he was saying that to make the role of lawyer is to make the world a better place. So probably exactly the same in a previous event, which I think was held here at the Institute as well. So, and certainly he would also agree with the idea that Hina Jilani expressed, that civil society has an extremely important role to play. And I was really, I was watching a video of Nino, which was shown, I think, in the event held in Geneva in 2012. Silvia was there as well, I think, and and he was, and he was recounting the story of the sparrow that holds the sky, which is published in the Human Dimension of International Law, and which has been recounted also many times. But before that, is really suggesting that civil society should do more to make international humanitarian law work more effectively. International civil society, the International Committee of the Red Cross as well. And I was really very intrigued by the fact that in a book recently published by two scholars of international relations, I think Semoglu and Robinson, the narrow corridor, which refers to democracy in general, but they identified the role of civil society precisely in keeping sovereign state sovereignty within the boundaries, in the narrow corridor. And I think this is the message that Nino wants to convey to us all in our roles as scholars, as practitioners. We cannot be only scholars. We cannot be only in our books. We cannot be only in our legal briefs. We need to make a conjunction between what we study, what we do as our profession, but this could apply to any of us in any area of the human activities. But we have also to try to give a contribution to society. And for him, and I conclude there, his contribution to society was also to try to spread the word about international law. His articles for La Repubblica, one of the things which I miss the most is receiving the email from Nino saying, I need to publish this tomorrow in La Repubblica. I need your comments like now. But I think it was really a privilege to be able to be associated to this kind of activity, because it went, and for me, who didn't want to be a lawyer in the first place in my professional life, maybe I'm not a lawyer, some would say, it was great to see that there was another way of being a lawyer. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to be part of Remembering Nino.
Thank you, Salvatore. I think inspired by you, we should come to the conclusion that we do not conclude. let the conversation continue over a drink, because that's absolutely essential for the conversation to continue, I think. But before doing so, I would like to say only one thing. If you ask a bunch of academics to organize something, you get some great ideas, but for the implementation, you need other people. So also on behalf of NEA, I would like to thank particularly the people within the Academy of European Law, Joyce Davies, Yasmin Sommerdal, Elisa, who've really done all the practical stuff. And we would also like to thank the catering staff who will now be serving you drinks, and the porters who are making extra hours in order to accommodate and welcome us all here. Of course, the final thanks is to Mrs. Jilani, who joined us today with very inspiring words. And we will bring a toast to you here, and we hope to see you one day here in person in Villa Salviati at the EUI. Thank you very much to everybody.